All right. Welcome to Sideboard MTG. My name's Eric, and we've got a spicy deck tech for you today. This is Rakdos Unsealing, a deck by Kenneth Hohbach. I hope you guys like the deck. Give it a thumbs up. Let him know you like it. And if you got some comments, some suggestions, a little bit of feedback for him, leave those in the comments below and we'll jump right into the deck tech here. Now I'm going to start with the lands. They're pretty simple. We've got 4 Canyon Sloughs, 4 Dragon Skull Summits, and then 4 utility lands to go along with our basics. Now those utility lands are Scavenger Grounds, Memorial to Folly, because bringing back a creature card can be back-breaking for our opponent if we're getting back something that can trigger our Sarkhan's Unsealing. Field of Ruin, because there are certain lands out there that have to be destroyed, so Field of Ruin is a must in these decks. And then of course Detection Tower, because Vinemare is a problem. Now Sarkhan's Unsealing is one of those cards where you're not doing a lot the turn that you actually play it, but you're going to make up for that the following turns. So we may need a little bit of protection to get into, turn 4 and 5 and 6 and so on to be able to actually start getting some usage out of this. Now, let's go ahead and cover this so that you know why each one of these cards are so important. Now, whenever you cast a creature spell with power 4, 5, or 6, Sarkhan's Unsealing is going to deal 4 damage to any target. Now, if you happen to cast a creature spell with power 7 or greater, it's going to do 4 damage to each opponent and each creature and planeswalker that they control. So how do we get into those later turns? Now we've got a bunch of 2-ofs here that work really well at protecting us, keeping the board state at a manageable presence, I guess. And Fatal Push and Cast Down is going to lead that off with our cheap removal. Now, we do have some Doomfalls here in the main board, along with an additional copy in the sideboard. But Doomfall works double duty. If your opponent has creatures, then you can always make them exile a creature. If they do not have creatures, you can rip a card out of their hand. It must be said that exiling a Nexus of Fate does reduce their chances of drawing a Nexus of Fate by about 3%. Now, it's not much, but getting each copy out of their deck is going to be exactly what you want to do. So the second phase of Doomfall works absolutely terrific, because that will exile it and it will not be shuffled back into their library. And then, of course, if your opponent has a ton of creature spells, Sweltering Suns could be exactly what you're looking for to be able to just wipe the board out. And then hopefully they're kind of living close to the top deck, and you can, kind of get ahead from there. Now, Sovereign's Bite, good little card to be able to gain you a little bit of life, and if you're already in a winning state, it works really well as a win more card to be able to actually deal a little bit of extra damage, giving you that little bit of extra reach that you might need to finish the game off. Now, again, this is not just a win more card, it also works really well at buying you enough life, enough time to kind of stay in the fight. Now, early creatures, and this is a very aggressive version of Sarkhan's Unsealing, early creatures that won't actually target Sarkhan's Unsealing are Glint Sleeve, Cypher, and Virishio or Pyromancer. Now, the Pyromancer works really well, and you may not want to play this early if you think your opponent may have some Planeswalkers and you need to deal the damage there, or if your opponent has, Planeswalkers being protected by fogs or something like that, or maybe even a wall of creatures. Virishio Pyromancer can deal a couple extra points of damage to those planeswalkers to buy you those couple needed turns before they can get to the ultimate, so that you can get your Sarkhan's Unsealing online. Now, Emmet Eternal, whether that's coming down the turn before or after Sarkhan's Unsealing, is absolutely phenomenal in the deck. You're only paying 3 mana for a 5/5 creature with a flick 3, so even if they go to block it, you're going to be doing some serious work with Emmet Eternal, dealing those 3 additional points of damage. But if your opponent decides they want to play Magic with their cards, you're going to start making your Emmet Eternal smaller and smaller. Again, no matter how small he gets, if he gets blocked, he's going to deal 3 points of damage. and it works kind of with a miniature combo here with the Scorpion God. Now, there's not a lot of copies of the Scorpion God, but Emmet Eternal, if your opponent does decide to play Magic, you're going to have neg 1/1 counters on your Emmet Eternal, and if it finally dies and you have the Scorpion God on the battlefield, you'll be able to draw a card. Now, that's not the only way that you're going to be able to do some cool interactions with the Scorpion God. The Scorpion God works as a really good late game mana sink, and because this deck tops out at 5, there's a good chance that you're going to have additional mana to be able to play creatures and be able to put neg 1/1 counters on things. So if we have a Sarkhan's Unsealing out, we can even deal with things like Lyra by putting a neg 1/1 counter on her, then casting something like an Emmet Eternal or a Joshu Vess and dealing the additional 4 points of damage to Lyra, or something with 5 toughness. Now, Infernal Hellion, probably one of the better cards that I've seen in these Sarkhan's Unsealing decks, and that's just because not only is it a 7 power creature for 4 mana, but after you've attacked with this 7 power trampler, if it does survive combat, you're going to shuffle it back into your library, and when you shuffle it back in, means you have a chance to redraw that card and replay that card. And I actually think that works as an advantage, not necessarily a disadvantage in these Sarkhan's Unsealing decks. Putting more of these back in your library is going to increase your chances of drawing them, so I do like Infernal Hellion here. And then, of course, we barely touched on Joshu Vess earlier. I don't think that you're going to be getting to 10 mana to be able to kick this. However, that could happen. Now, most of the time, this is just going to be a 4 mana, 4/5 with Menace that's going to continue to pressure your opponent. And again, the closer you can get your opponent down to that lower life total, then any creature off the top of your deck is more than likely going to help you finish the game. So Joshu Vess works absolutely great with that. And another card that actually fits the Rakdos theme better than most is Dire Fleet Ravager. Rakdos has always been really big on, paying their own life to be able to make sure they can deal life to you, and Dire Fleet Ravager does just that. Not only is it a 4/4 with Menace and Death Touch, but when it enters the battlefield, each opponent will lose a third of their life rounded up. So if your opponent does have, let's say 15 life, they're going to lose 5 life just for Dire Fleet Ravager entering the battlefield. Now, yet, you're going to lose some of that life too, just depending on your current life total, but putting their life total at a lower number is going to be absolutely terrific for you. Now, I will say that your Sarkhan's Unsealing trigger will go on the stack before you get your Enter the Battlefield trigger from your Dire Fleet Ravager. So if you're only pointing your Sarkhan's Unsealing at your opponent, they're going to have a lower life total by the time that Dire Fleet Ravager's triggered and the ability goes off. So they're going to have less life to work with, but still removing their life is exactly what we want to do. And that's why there's cards like Demanding Dragon. Now, of course, Demanding Dragon, I think, doesn't fit quite as well as Glorybringer in the deck, because, Glorybringer is just such an all-star of a card. I think after rotation, we're going to see a lot more of Demanding Dragon, but for right now, I'm a big fan of Glorybringer. But when Demanding Dragon enters the battlefield, it's going to deal 5 damage to target opponent unless that player sacrifices a creature. So if they don't have a creature to sacrifice, or you killed the creature with your Sarkhan's Unsealing trigger, then they're going to be forced to take 5 points of damage, and that works really, really well. So Sarkhan's Unsealing helps you kind of hedge or swing that choice your opponent's going to be making in your favor. Now, Glorybringer can do some of the same work. With Glorybringer, you can Sarkhan's Unsealing, deal 4 damage to your opponent or a creature, exert your Glorybringer, deal another 4 damage to an opponent, or to a creature, and then Glorybringer coming on in to deal 4 damage to the opponent. We're looking at 12 damage being distributed amongst the battlefield and your players if you have a Sarkhan's Unsealing and cast a Glorybringer. So I do really like Glorybringer in these decks, and we've already hit on the Scorpion God. So that is your main board here. Let's take a look at the sideboard and some options we have for control decks and other decks. Now, against control, you're more than likely going to want to bring in your 4 copies of Duress, your 2 copies of Kitesail Freebooter, and depending on what control deck you're playing, maybe or maybe not some Sorcerer's Spyglass copies. Now, Sorcerer's Spyglass is absolutely terrific against, Teferi. We've seen that, be used to some great extent against Teferi, but it also works against cards like the Scarab God, Hazoret, so they can't activate abilities, things of that nature. Against Hazoret, I would prefer to use one of the 2 copies of Paraska's Contempt that are here, but if this is an option, do remember that Sorcerer's Spyglass only works on activated abilities, so make sure you're not calling Search for Escanta, but instead you're calling Escanta the Sunken Ruin. So when they finally flip it, they can't actually activate it. The abilities on the front side of those cards are triggered, not activated. Now, you can call Nicol Bolas, whether it's the Ravinder or the Planeswalker. You can call either one of those. If you call the Ravinger, they're still going to be able to play it. They're still going to make you discard a card, but they're not going to be able to activate it and turn it into the Planeswalker. So there's some good things that you can use there. Now, unfortunately, you can't stop Embalm with this. Because the creature will not be on the battlefield, it will not be affected by this static ability. So you can, they can embalm creatures that have these abilities. Now we do have an additional copy of Doomfall, and we have 2 copies of Murder. Now, if you wanted to just run Unlicensed Disintegration, I think that would be an absolutely terrific call. But after rotation, we're not going to have Unlicensed Disintegration, and Murder is going to be the way to go. I personally think that until rotation, though, Murder should probably just be Unlicensed Disintegration, as it's a little bit lighter on the converted mana cost. Not necessarily converted mana cost, but colors of mana. You're not having to have double black, so you can get away with just 1 red, 1 black, and a colorless to cast it. There's not many artifacts in the deck, but there is that slight chance that you might get that additional little bit of damage out of it against a control deck or something, which you're probably not going to bring Murder in for anyway, so doesn't really matter. But I think that until rotation, Unlicensed Disintegration in these Rakdos decks is just slightly better. So that's actually my only critiques on this deck. Murder should be Unlicensed Disintegration, and Demanding Dragon should be more copies of Glorybringer. Other than that, we do have the Hours of Devastation. Absolutely great card. Kitesail Freebooter, being able to rip cards out of our opponent's hand. That is the deck, guys. If you want to see some gameplay, we're going to have gameplay coming up sometime within the next 24 to 48 hours. So make sure you hit that subscribe button so you can catch that. Kenneth, I like the deck. I've gotten a couple, test runs in with it so far. Looks pretty sweet. I love how aggressive it is, and we'll see you in the gameplay.